across the border between Russia and the nearest country. He was camouflaged, I guess you would say, under in a hay cart with a hay over him, and
he was how old at the time?
14 years old, and he was in Berlin for I don't know how long a period. He worked at the railroad station or something of the sort, carrying baggage, and received tips for this, and he did it till he earned his passage across to the United States, to America.
Well, where had he lived in Russia?
His parents lived in Kiev. There were 5 brothers, and they sent all of their sons to the United States. Dad was the 3rd one who came. The oldest went to Rhode Island, and he lived there all of his life and raised a big family of girls and 2 sons. The youngest son came to Charleston when he was 16 years old and worked for my father, and learned how to establish himself, and he lived in Charleston the rest of his life.
What was the family name?
The name was, Dad went to Philadelphia first, to the home of a half-brother who had taken the name of Goldman. And years later, when my sister Jean was living there, Dad hired a detective to try to find this family, and he never found them. He had lived with them for a period of time and gone to night school in Philadelphia, and he wanted to thank them again and see them. And we used to say, they're lost and they're probably the members of the Goldman band. That was a famous band at that time. And he first went to Cincinnati, where his 2nd brother was living there.
What name did the brothers take?
They took the name of Goldman. They all did. But their real name was Austrian, and it was a long, funny name.
Someone had told me that Osheretna was the name.
Osheretna, how did you remember that, Bill, for heaven's sakes? That's what he said. And he later on, I think the first store he had was in Ashland, Kentucky. He also had a store in Arlington, Ohio, Huntington, West Virginia, Charleston. I don't know exactly when all of these were founded or opened. And at one time, he had about 10 stores, plus a half an interest in a furniture store in Bedford, Indiana.
And would the stores have the same name? Was it like a little chain?
Yes, Liberty Clothing Company. And I believe I have a paper with that name on it someplace. I'll also show you, Susan, I'm rambling, you know that. Mm-hmm. I have some paper cocktail napkins from his 80th birthday that we gave for him at the country club. I have them in the other room.
Oh, yes, I remember that. Mm-hmm. And I remember the play that the grandchildren performed, or was it a poem that we wrote and performed?
I don't remember
about
that.
grandfather's life. You don't? There was a young man in the community who helped us write it. He was in the state legislature.
Paul Kaufman.
Paul Kaufman,
yeah,
wrote a poem, and each of the grandchildren had a different stanza about grandfather's life.
I don't remember that. Anyhow.
What was it like for you growing up in Charleston when you were a young girl?
We just grew up naturally. We had a big family, and we enjoyed being together. And I can remember, well, we lived in 2 places before. We lived at 1416 Poirier Street. That's the place I remember most. And I'll tell you something about your mother. She was the last baby, and we looked at her and thought she was ugly. Well, she was an ugly duckling. She turned out to be the prettiest one in the family. Now, what else can I say about Grandpa? Well, grandfather was a chairman of the Boy Scouts for the county, and he earned the Silver Beaver. And he was asked to run for mayor, and he said no, he wouldn't do that. And he was on a committee. He was a Republican. And when the head of the committee went to the convention, I remember this man went to, he'd call in his committee and talk to them, asking what they would like him to bring to the attentions of the meeting in of the convention, you know, to present. And Dad said he didn't want any recognition. He just wanted to do the best he could for the town and for the people, individual people there. I remember he said he was on too many committees and did too much work. He was on the board of the temple for 30 years. And I said that to my dearest friend's mother, and she said, you know what? All he has to do is say no. That was Esther Moses Lipinski's mother, who was a wonderful person. Now,
How did you meet your mom?
my mother came to Charleston to visit I think she was slightly in the family. Her last name was Solomon, Becky Solomon. And she was the daughter of my mother's aunt's sister, who came to Charleston once to visit us with Aunt Lena. And there was a thunderstorm. And the two old ladies got all upset, and they hid themselves in the closet and asked my grandmother for a drink of a blackberry cordial that she made. And, well, Dad was pretty well. He was a kind of a person who was very gregarious, and he was known all over town. He didn't ask for favors for himself, but he tried to straighten out different things that happened to other people. And he would tell us, he would call us before, when there was a campaign for voting, and when voters, the day, he'd call us and tell us how to vote. Well, we just listened to him and then voted as we pleased. But he didn't vote a straight ticket either. He always remembered just who he thought was the best man anyhow.
So when your grandma was there, I mean your mother, for this to visit, then did they meet at the temple or at the home?
No, they met at this Mrs. Solomon's home.
Uh,
And my mother told me he was very stingy. He brought her half a pound of candy. And they were married August the 7th in 1905. And
so she stayed around long enough to romance her there in Charleston, huh?
well, he lived in Charleston. He had a store there at the time. I'll tell you another story funny about, Dad was living in Ashland, Kentucky. And he was always, I say he was well known every place he was, and he tried to do what he thought was the right thing. Well, the Catholic priest came to him one day and said, I'm worried about this girl. She's getting too familiar with too many men, and I don't like what's going on. Will you talk to her, M.B.? So Dad asked Susie, or whatever her name was. I didn't mean to use Susie. He took her out. That's one reason why he didn't learn to drive a car. He knew how to have a horse and buggy. And he took her out in the horse and buggy and tried to tell her where she was making her mistakes and that she'd better find somebody and get married, and she'd be better off. And she looked at Dad and said, "I'll marry you, NB." She was a little Irish girl. He
Was
said,
she an employee of his?
No,
No.
just,
I
just
wonder-
somebody that, everybody in the small town knew everybody else.
Uh-huh.
And he was just trying to help out, doing what the Catholic priest had asked him to do.
Now, your mother was German.
My mother came from, they came over in the 1850s. I'm not sure of the exact year. Mother was born in the United States.
In Cincinnati?
And grandmother had a big family. Grandmother remembered seeing Abraham Lincoln when they let the school children out to see him when he came to Cincinnati. I'm not sure whether it was after the start of the war or before it. And her mother was living in Cincinnati too, and her brothers came to Cincinnati at that time, and they came from a small town, and grandmother used to say, "Same miles hinder Berlin." And we never heard the name of the town, that's all we knew. And it happened during the Second World War, when the Jews were being harassed by Hitler, just before the war started, when everybody was trying to get out of Germany. My last cousin in Cincinnati heard through, I'm not sure whether it was through an organization or through directly, somebody from some connection of that family tried to contact him, and probably wanting to get out of Germany. And when he tried to help him, he found that he couldn't find the connection at all, so we never heard from them again. That you didn't know, Susie.
No, I remember a story about during World War I. Someone came to the door, and your grandmother was afraid to answer the door because of her German accent.
She didn't have a German accent. She was born, she went to school in this country.
Your grandmother?
Yes.
Or maybe it was Aunt Jules?
No, they were all born in this country. Where'd you
Uh-huh.
get this story from?
I don't know.
I don't think it could have happened.
Were there times when the Kanawha River froze over and you went
Yes.
ice skating?
No, my
No.
brother walked across it, and we stood on the porch looking over at him, and Mother was always afraid of everything. And I had to try to help her to forget her fears, and
Mm-hmm.
he came back. Bud had a little boat out on the river during the summer months too. And I remember one story that Mildred told us, that Bud had an old car, an old Ford that he worked on, and when he was 16, my mother must have heard some whispering around, and she said, "Now, Morris, don't you dare let that boy do anything with that car." Well, he and some of his friends were planning to take a trip out of town, and one morning, bright and early in the summer, they got in the car and they drove to Virginia Beach. And they stole corn out of a cornfield for food, and apples, and foolishly they made applesauce and wanted to strain it, and they found an old screen. Well, it was so black they couldn't eat it. And Mother, of course, nearly had a fit when she knew that Bud was gone. He was to be pitied. He was one boy out of a family of 4 girls. And he was very good-natured. He was he was 5'11". He was a nice, big, tall, and here my father was just 5'2". And he had so much to look forward to, and he began to develop this arthritis when he was about 23 years old and had to go and live in Phoenix.
And
I'm
when,
rambling, what?
when Bud went to Phoenix, your mother went out
Yes,
to
first.
help him.
And yes, and she couldn't take it any longer, and Mildred was the only one left, not married or not working, so she went out to keep house for Bud, and that's how she met your father.
And how did you meet Uncle Henry?
I went to school in Evanston, Illinois, Northwestern, and I joined a sorority, AE Phi, and during that year, Henry and Dan had gone to Illinois, but they were living very near to the campus, and during the affairs from the 1st of September on, all the boys came to our dances and everything. And I met Henry then, and his brother Dan. They hadn't, Dan was going to Northwestern. Henry didn't want to return to school. And we knew each other for 6 years before we were married. And we corresponded. It turned into that, that's all.
One of the things I was thinking about when, before the camera's on, we were talking about back in Kiev. And I thought you said the oldest son in some family had gone off to war and didn't get back.
The oldest brother, I said there were 5 left, but the oldest one was taken by the army and didn't return. And that, just like the history of many families, decided the parents to get their children out of Russia. I remember seeing a picture of my grandfather, who was a tall man, standing there with somebody else, a snap that was sent from Russia. My grandfather never came to the United States, but he also had one daughter whom he sent over, and she lived with us in Charleston for a short time, but she was so unhappy. She only spoke Russian, and she was, they were all boys, and she was the only girl. So Dad took her back to New York and settled her with a group of Russian Jews. And she married and raised her children there, and Dad was in touch with her all the time that that he lived. And when he died, her name was Gordon, her last name, that was her married name. And I corresponded with her for a short time. I'm not sure whether she inherited something from Dad, but she was very grateful to him all her life, and he would go to visit her once in a while when he was in New York on business.
What did do you know what his family did in Kiev? If they were...
I have no idea, but his father, he told us, was a fisherman, a Jewish fisherman. And I said, can you ever think of anybody who was a Jewish fisherman, of all things? And he was away for months at a time, all the way to the, what's the Danube River, and then back to Russia. And I always was amused by the fact that he was a Jewish fisherman.
What did your father tell you about his life when he first arrived in Philadelphia? I think I had heard a story that
I don't know what
he had a quarter or a nickel and, of course, didn't speak English.
Yeah.
How did he find his family in Philadelphia?
This I've never heard of, Susan. I can't tell you any more about that.
And he had a brother who had several sons.
He had a brother. He had 3 brothers in this country. The oldest one,
Do you know the names?
yes. One was Abe, the second one, just older than Dad. I'm trying to think of the name of the oldest one. Began with an S. I don't know.
Samuel?
So, it wasn't Simon and it wasn't Saul. I don't know what it could have been. I knew he had daughters, and I knew the two youngest daughters. I went to school in Boston. Did I ever tell you this? In Newton, rather, for a year, and I got to know them. I went when I left to return home in the spring. I stopped in Providence, Rhode Island, to meet them. Now their youngest brother came to live with us, I mentioned earlier, in Charleston. His name was Irving. And Dad let him work at the store and learn the business. And he finally opened a store of his own right in Charleston. And the second one, Abe, lived in Cincinnati. Oh, and he's the one who had 3 sons and 2 daughters. Is this what you meant, Susan?
I think so.
And they were all very good doctors in Cincinnati. The oldest one's name was, what's his name?
He's a dermatologist.
Yes, sure.
Who invented
Yeah,
the
and he lives
laser.
in down here in
Southern
La
California.
Jolla. And last year, a year ago in June, when I was visiting, I found his name in the paper. He was a very well-known dermatologist. He's really known all over the world. I know it so well. I visited in their home twice, and their sister Dorothy visited us in Charleston too. And now the second one was a diagnostician. The third one was a dentist. But the oldest, I can't think of his name.
I believe he pioneered
Yes,
therapy with lasers.
Yes, he did. And Linda drove me down to La Jolla a year ago last June, and we went to visit him. I called him first, and when I saw his name in the Santa Barbara paper.
Isn't his name Goldman?
Sure, his name is Goldman. I can't think of his first name, though, and I know it so well. Linda drove David and I down there, and he had a lot of his work in the living room. And we talked about that mostly instead of, talking about family affairs.
Mm-hmm. And I had heard there was some distance in the family because
Yes.
his father had expected your father to help his children in college. And this was during the
No,
Depression.
that wasn't it.
During the Depression, and your father
My
had
father helped the youngest one, George, and he had 2 children, and they were redheads, and he took me to see them once. They're the ones who had a hard time getting along, and Dad's helped support them for a long time. And when Uncle Abe died, and he was a very nice, sensitive person, and I remember being there in his home when I was a child, when I visited my Aunt Sarah in Cincinnati. And then later, his daughter Dorothy came to visit me. Leon Goldman was the dermatologist's name. And he's the one who did work with the laser beam, one of the first. I believe he was the first. He was known pretty much all over the world, and he was known in Russia too, I remember that. Well, I called Leon after I saw an article in the Santa Barbara paper, and we talked a while, and he answered the phone, and I asked, I told him that I'd like to see him, and he wanted to see me. And I told him I would be down in Laguna in the end of June, and that Linda would drive me down there. So David and Linda and I went, and they live in a condominium very close to town, and we spent an hour with them, and he did artwork with the laser beam, and he had a lot of the statues in his living room.
Yes, I saw an exhibit in Tucson once of his work.
Just
with the
his,
laser. Yes, it was.
just his individual work, nobody else's?
Just his. It was about 15 years ago when I was working for the University of Arizona Press, and on campus there was an exhibit.
For heaven's sake.
And that was the first time I knew that he was a distant relative. Now, what were you telling us about your mother's life when she was growing up in Cincinnati, that she attended a Catholic school?
They were day students at a convent.
And why was it they attended a Catholic school?
Because the nuns were so had the knowledge of embroidery, and grandmother used to love to embroider, but she wanted them to learn to do these things the best way. And they attended, and when they attended the school as day students.
But did they also learn English and mathematics?
No, just as far as I know, it was just embroidery.
Oh, I see. And this is an example of her work?
Yeah.
This is a fireplace screen.
A fire screen, you called it.
That was in my grandparents' home at 2020 Kanawha Boulevard.
That's right.
In Charleston, West Virginia.
That's right.
And did she have any other stories about life at the Catholic school?
No.
When she was older, she worked in a store in Cincinnati, your mother?
Yes, well, that would be a long, long story. The three brothers, the three Touch brothers, after the Civil War, were in the clothing business. In those days, you didn't go into a store and buy a suit. You had to be measured according to, before it was made up. And when the soldiers returned from the army, they would take a few of them in and measure them for a suit and let them out, and then take another few in. And it was a tailoring business is what it was called. Well, one of the older brothers, there was my grandmother's in-laws, her brother-in-law and her sister-in-law had, I think it was 5 sons, I'm not sure. They started gambling, wine, women, and song, and they spoiled the whole business. I guess the gamblers were after these sons to pay up their debts, and my grandfather felt that he had to help them out too. And he told my grandmother, if you don't, the house, I guess, was in her name. It was a big house in Cincinnati. It was next to, later years, it was next to the railroad station. And when we drove down there, Mother wanted to see her old home when we drove that past, and she pointed it out to us. Well, my grandfather said, if you don't sign this, I'm going to kill myself. And grandmother had to sign her house away, and they lost everything. The furniture that she had in her home, her bedroom furniture, she brought to Charleston. She brought what was called her whatnot cabinet. It was, you remember that little shelf in the living room?
Doesn't Aunt Charlotte have that?